Why is predestination necessary? Whenever predestination is discussed, many people question, doesn't this negate human free will? However, do proponents of predestination truly claim that free will does not exist? If not, how should one correctly understand predestination? 1. Predestination does not assert that humans lack free will. Even Calvin did not address predestination within the context of theology proper, but just before discussing ecclesiology. This implies that predestination is a confession regarding our salvation. I thought my faith began with me, but it turns out God's grace was there beforehand. 2. The difference between Arminianism and Calvinism highlights this distinction. In Arminianism, A. Christ died for all people. B. Now humans must come to Christ. From this point, salvation depends on human response, whether one believes or not. 3. Calvinism, however, is fundamentally opposed to Arminianism at this point. In the Arminian structure, since Christ has done everything for our salvation, humans now must act. 4. Many people, despite their efforts, find it impossible to believe in Christ on their own. In such cases, I have observed that many Arminians respond with, "Try harder," or "You can't believe because you aren't trying hard enough." 5. Outside of Calvinism, receiving salvation requires our effort. For example, one must pray fervently to receive the gift of tongues and be saved. However, the problem remains that even with such efforts, some still find it impossible to believe. 6. This is where Calvinism begins. No matter how hard I try, I cannot do it. God must do it. 7. When we confess that we cannot believe by our own strength, God begins the work of faith in us. Calvinism speaks of total helplessness and God's sovereignty, asserting that the initiation of our faith is not by us but by God. This is the correct understanding of predestination. 8. Many evangelicals insist on fervent prayer or dedicated service, claiming that one must strive in their faith life to receive the gift of tongues or salvation. However, as a Calvinist, I believe that while diligent effort may open more channels for grace, ultimately, if God does not grant it, it is in vain. Thus, as means of grace, it is appropriate to pray earnestly and worship diligently to experience more grace. 9. Nonetheless, in approaching these means of grace, the responses of evangelicals and Calvinists differ significantly, though subtly. Evangelicals risk saying, "You didn't receive grace because you didn't try hard enough," while Reformed theology fundamentally rejects the notion that human efforts can earn grace. 10. Arminianism risks falling into legalism, whereas Calvinism risks encouraging laziness and denying human free will. Personally, I find Calvinism more consistent with the gospel, yet both Calvinists and Arminians must be aware of and cautious about their respective weaknesses. 11. Lastly, predestination should not be understood in a way that denies human free will. As seen above, predestination is a confession that our faith began not with our efforts, but with grace.